Good morning. As you can see from the screen, we're going to be talking about more instances of unbelief, which obviously we already talked about some instances of unbelief in the past, but I want to look at a few more today. And the first one that we will look at is the brothers of Christ. The brothers of Christ. In John chapter 7 and verse 5, for neither did his brethren believe in him. Wouldn't that be awful for Jesus to know that his own brothers didn't really believe in who he was? Not while he was pretty much living anyway. Jesus' brothers, as a matter of fact, were urging Jesus in this context to go to Jerusalem so that his disciples could see his signs. Now that may sound good, but they did not have a good purpose behind what they were saying. Their indication was, their idea was, that they didn't believe, not that they believed in these signs or anything of that nature. They just thought he wanted to be seen openly. You know, you want people to see you, you want people to see you openly, so go to Jerusalem. Show your signs, which they probably didn't even believe in, to your disciples. So show yourself to the world. But Jesus plainly says to his brothers that they did not believe on him. So while it may sound good, that was not what was going on, and Jesus knew that, because Jesus said that you do not believe. Neither did his brethren believe in him. Unbelief. Later on, at least some of the brothers did believe in him, but at this point they did not, and that had to be kind of hurtful to Jesus at this point for that to be the case. Another example that we have of unbelief is found in Thomas. And again, like with the brothers, some may try to say, well, it seems like they were saying something good, and some have tried to make a positive thing out of what Thomas said as well. But actually, there's not a lot of positive really in it. In John chapter 20 and verse 25, the other disciples, Thomas was not there on this occasion, said unto him, that is to Thomas, we have seen the Lord. But he said unto them, except I shall see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe. That sounds kind of radical, or whatever word you might want to use on that. I want to put my finger into the holes. I want to thrust my hand into his side. And until that point, I'm not going to believe you. I'm not going to believe what you say. Now that could be hurtful as well to the disciples, that their friend Thomas did not believe what they were saying. But Thomas had not been present, as I said. He was not there for the Resurrection Sunday gathering. And when the other 10 disciples told him that they had seen the Lord, he was unconvinced. He wanted to examine the evidence personally. He would not be satisfied unless he could touch the nail wounds, put his hand into the gash in Jesus' side. I don't think I would need to go that far myself to actually put my hand in somebody's wound. I think if I just saw it, I would know that there was something there if I even needed to see it. But He wanted to put his hand into the gash. He wanted a scientific test. Now that part of it, we can perhaps see some good in, which it shows, for one thing, that what we believe about Jesus is not just based on a faith that just, okay, I accept it. Although some things can be. There's nothing really wrong with that as far as I'm concerned. But there are many things that we believe in that science or other avenues show us also to be true. And there's nothing wrong that that is the case either. But he wanted, it seems, a scientific test. And the case for the resurrection became progressively stronger because later he did see. And Jesus said, okay, here they are, put your finger in. Here's my side, put your hand in. And he wouldn't do it then. He didn't need to. He just simply looked at Jesus and said, my Lord and my God. But there's nothing wrong with having scientific evidence either. And all of this just goes to be more proof that the resurrection is true, that it is indeed true. But for a while, Thomas would not believe without that so-called evidence, or that evidence. Also then, there are the Jews of Iconium. The Jews of Iconium who showed unbelief. In Acts chapter 14 and verse 2, but the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and made their minds ill affected against the brethren. The unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and made their minds evil affected against the brethren. Are these people really telling us the truth? Oh, they're telling you things that aren't true. They're not telling you the whole thing. Whatever they may have been saying to these people, they were stirring them up and causing trouble because they were unbelieving. Now, when you compare Acts chapter 14 and verse 2, as you see it there, with the first verse, then what you have is being able to see exactly what we're talking about as far as believing and unbelieving. Verse 1 says, now it happened in Iconium that they were together to the synagogue. They went together to the synagogue of the Jews, and so spoke that a great multitude, both of the Jews and of the Greeks, believed. Now, obviously, when it says that they believed, it meant that they obeyed. They obeyed the gospel. So we see that correlation between believing and faith, and believing and obedience. And unbelieving is not being obedient. When you compare the two verses together, you see what the difference is. And the difference is obedience. In verse 1, the people were obedient to what they heard. The people in verse 2 were not obedient. And not only not obedient, but then they stirred up trouble among the others. The unbelieving would not obey, and because of this, and because of their attitude, there was great trouble. Enough trouble that Paul and Barnabas moved on. They moved on to preach at other places. And you know what? Those today who are not obedient or unbelieving still cause trouble for the church. Now, hopefully it's not to a point where people have to get up and go away, like Paul and Barnabas did on this occasion, to go to another place, at least for a time being, they did. But it can still cause trouble. So it shows that, that there's a difference here between the two, believing, unbelieving, and the difference is in their obedience. There are some who try to say that those who are not exactly showing a belief, or maybe they're just falling down, falling away, that doesn't mean that they're not obedient. Yes, it does mean exactly that, because they go hand in hand. If we're believing, then we're going to be obedient. But if we're unbelieving, then we are not being obedient. Another example that we have then is the Thessalonian Jews. The Thessalonian Jews, they also were unbelievers. And in Acts chapter 17, verse 5, but the Jews, which believed not, moved with envy, took unto them certain lewd fellows of the baser sort, and gathered a company, and set all the city on an uproar, and assaulted the house of Jason, and sought to bring them out to the people. So once again, what we have is a group of people who are unbelieving and causing trouble. A case of unbelieving Jews causing trouble. They were jealous. They were jealous because Paul and Silas had basically taken over the synagogue with their teaching and had many people listening to them. Maybe more people than was listening to them. And so they were jealous because of that. And knowing that they did not have enough people really to oppose them, then they went out and they gathered up some unsavory characters, some vile people to listen to them, to join with them. People from the rabble, it says. People from the rabble. They just went out and found some people who were just basically sitting around town doing nothing and were known to be troublemakers, and said, "Hey, come and help us. You know, we're gonna cause a stir. You want to join with us? Yeah, we like to cause trouble." I don't know that was the conversation. The Bible doesn't tell us that, but still, they went out and got this rabble together to help them, and this mob formed. And under the impression that Paul and Silas were staying with a brother named Jason, this mob rushed the house, and they intended to bring them out to a citizens committee for trial. But when they came up empty-handed and Paul and Silas were not there, then they grabbed Jason and took him instead, and certain brethren with him, and they dragged them to the town rulers. And Paul and Silas then were accused of turning the whole empire upside down. That may sound like a bad thing, but that would be wonderful. That would be wonderful, really, if we became known as people who were turning the town that we live in upside down because we're teaching the truth. And many people don't want to hear the truth, but we would hope that they would, and we'd try to get them to. But to be out there in such a way that everyone knows, and for it to be said that we were turning the city upside down would be great. But here is just another instance of what unbelief can do. It can cause trouble. And the people cause trouble. Then there are the Ephesians. The Ephesians. In Acts chapter 19 and verse 9, Acts 19 verse 9, "But when divers were hardened and believed not, but spake evil of that way, for the multitude, he departed from them and separated the disciples, disputing daily in the school of one Tyrannus." So here what we have is they were having, again, some success. They were having some success in their teaching of the Ephesian people. And then, all of a sudden, the atmosphere began to change. Things became different. And for a third time now, unbelievers who had become hardened, just another way of saying that they had become disobedient, They became hardened, they became disobedient, and now they're going to cause trouble. And they spoke evil of the way. That may not have been the first time that was done, and it certainly wasn't the last time. There are many who have at one point been members of the church and then left and then speak evil of the church as though it's the church's fault. And that's what these folks were doing, speaking evil of the way. And however, Paul was able to still continue to teach there. And he taught in a local school, probably that they rented, and he was there for about 2 years doing that, teaching in the school. But again, we can see what unbelief or disobedience can do. It can cause trouble. It can cause trouble. Another incident of unbelief we see in the Jews in Jerusalem. In Romans chapter 15, verse 31, Romans 15:31, that I may be delivered from them that do not believe in Judea, and that my service which I have for Jerusalem may be accepted of the saints. Here is a prayer. And you know, Paul really believed in prayer. He believed in prayer and the power of prayer. And in this verse, one of the things that he prays for is to be delivered from the disobedient Jews in Judea. And we should also pray to be delivered from the disobedient. Pray that the disobedient do not hinder us from teaching. And that's what he was praying for here. And if you go to Acts chapter 21, and I'm not going to read the entire context there, but if you start in Acts chapter 21 and read for quite a while there, beginning in 21, verse 30, and all the city was disturbed, and the people ran together, seized Paul, and dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. And they took him, and they were going to persecute him. And again, Paul tells the story then in the next chapter about how that he persecuted the way himself. But now he was teaching the truth, and he's about to be beaten when he says, is it lawful to beat a man who is a Roman citizen? A Roman citizen, that excited them then. How did you get to be a Roman citizen? I was born. Wait a minute, I had to pay a lot of money to get my citizenship. Well, Paul said, I was born a citizen. It was against the law for a Roman to beat another Roman. And so, he was spared. And his prayer is answered. The prayer that he prayed, that we see in Romans chapter 15 and verse 31, is answered when we read Acts 21 and following. And we see that indeed, that Paul was delivered when he proclaimed his Roman citizenship, the power of prayer. And then another example that we have of unbelief is the one that we just mentioned, and that Paul mentions himself, and that is him, Saul. In the book of 1 Timothy 1 and verse 3, who was before a blasphemer and a persecutor and injurious, but I obtained mercy, because I did it ignorantly in unbelief. He had been a blasphemer. That is, he spoke against the Christian way. He spoke against it. A persecutor. That is, he put to flight the people of God as they ran for their very lives. Literally. And injurious. That is, he harmed them, even with sadistic fervor, is the indication from the way that Paul puts it. And so he had been an unbeliever, but, you know, everything that we've looked at so far has kind of had some bad news to it and unbelieving, but here's the point. Not just with Saul, but with any unbeliever. Anyone who becomes an unbeliever. Anyone who is an unbeliever. Anyone who is disobedient to God's will can obtain mercy, that is, pity from God. Saul did, and anyone can. They can obtain that pity, and he was unaware of the evil nature of what he was doing. He thought he was doing right, but he wasn't, and ignorance was no excuse, and he had to overcome that. And he was baptized into Christ to have his sins washed away, And then he was pardoned and he was brought into